fun show ahead, but let's get straight into it with a look back at the Masters. Chris Dobey adds his name to the PDC Major Roll of Honour following Johnny Clayton in 2021, Joe Cullen in 2022 to win the Masters, and with it also get an invite to the Premier League. What did you make of his run to the title?
Obviously, he caught a little fortune en route, but you have to win a title. We always say that. The only time I can remember someone who didn't catch much fortune on the way to a title was Mickey Mantle, because he won 6-0, 6-0, 6-0, 6-1, 6-0 to start that day off. You don't really need to catch much fortune if your opponent's not winning a leg. Beyond that absurd day in Wigan, you need to catch some luck on the way to a title, and Dobey caught his in the final. Rob Cross played what was by far his worst match of the weekend. Mere 22 points off of his first match when he beat Gary Anderson, and where Gary Anderson had the highest ever losing average in leg play in a best out of 19 match or longer, averaging 111 to Rob Cross's 112, which finally means Rob Cross is at a higher televised average than he did in the World Final now 5 years ago when he beat Phil Taylor with north of 107. He finally topped that match against Gary Anderson, and he dropped off significantly in the final. And you know what? So did Chris Dobey. When they went off the stage for the second break, they were both averaging just north of 90, or I think Cross was actually still just under 90 at that time. But Dobey lifted his game and Cross didn't. And in the end, that's why he crossed, no pun intended, crossed the line and pulled away in that final session. But he was consistent over the weekend, Dobey was. His lowest average was that 94.05 in the final, but his highest average was his first match at 96.89. So over the course of his 5 matches on the way to lifting the title, there was only 3 points in his average. He played at a very, very steady clip. And yes, no one threw their best stuff at him. I mentioned Rob Cross. Michael Smith dropped significantly as well for that semifinal. Michael Smith just didn't have it in that match. But, after winning the World Championship, after winning a World Series event, after just dominating Danny Noppert after a tight first 10 legs in that match to dominate those last 5 legs, it seemed like Michael Smith just plateaued for a little while, and that was what Chris Dobey needed. He was consistent at that mid-90s, 95 average over the course of 5 matches, over the course of nearly 60 legs. And that's going to win more matches than it won't. It won't always win the title. It probably won't win a title most of the time, because at some point you think someone's going to really throw something at you. But if you average 95, I don't care what the length of the match is. I don't care what the round of the competition is. A 95 average is going to win more than 50% of the time against nearly anyone in the world. And he did that in every single match. And sometimes that will be enough to win the title. And if you've done that, you really can't say it was undeserved. He was the most consistent player throughout the tournament. He was on his B/A- game the entire time, and credit to him. And he had some scalps along the way. We'll come on to Luke Humphries and Joe Cullen and Dirk van Dijvenbode a couple questions time when we talk about players who missed out on the Premier League. But none of them threw their best at him, but they all threw okay. They all threw that same average at Dobey that Dobey threw at them. And those are all players who we talked about and we fancied as potentially winning this. Joe Cullen won it last year. Luke Humphries won 4 Euro Tours last year. Deep runs in a couple other majors, and everyone thought was in the Premier League. Dirk van Dijvenbode came within a leg of winning a televised major last year and looked live pretty much every tournament he was in to bring home the silverware. And Dobey beat them, and he beat Dirk convincingly. He beat Luke and Joe in tight matches. He held his nerve and got over the line. And then he took advantage of 2 world champions in Michael Smith and Rob Cross who were off their game, and Dobey looked the better player in both those matches. You can't say that it was undeserved. He was consistent, and he played at that level that will win more than half the time. And sometimes, like it was in Milton Keynes at the weekend, that'll be enough to win your first major.
We teed it up on last week's show, our preview to the Masters. We said who could do a Johnny Clayton or a Joe Cullen win their first singles TV title at the Masters, and we discussed who was best placed. We talked about Luke Humphries, Stephen Bunting, Dirk van Dijvenbode, Damon Heta. It ended up being a player ranked below all of them. Chris Dobey, world number 21, eclipses Johnny Clayton's record in the Masters 2 years ago. He was 18th, so he's now the lowest ranked player to win the Masters. And did he produce performances like we saw from Clayton 2 years ago or Cullen last year? You'd say no, but as you touched on there, it was that consistency all the way through. His average for the tournament was a touch over 95, and you look at all of his games over the weekend and he was around that 94 to 96 mark, and there wasn't a flashy 105, 110 in there. There wasn't a 112 like Rob Cross or Gary Anderson who had that 111, but some of the key moments from that weekend, and he made the most of them. The 1-2-5 finish to break against Joe Cullen to go 4-3 up. Joe Cullen called it a killer. Nice reference for Golden Balls there for our UK listeners who watched that show. And the second round, the 160 finish, an even bigger finish to hold in 12 darts to go 9-8 up. Luke Humphries waiting on 84 and then breaking in 15 darts to win 10-8. And the quarterfinals, well, he had that 140 early on in the game against Dirk to break for 4-4. Dirk sat on tops to go 5-3 up, and even in the semi-final as well, beating an off-colour Michael Smith who averaged 90, but the 118 finish to go 4-4, Smith could have held there for 5-3. These are key moments in the games, aren't they? And he just felt like he had that knack of winning the important legs, the important moments in games. He came out on top in all of them, and as you mentioned there with the final, Rob Cross averaging 90 in the end, and it was a fairly flat final, it's got to be said, but there were some impressive moments in there for Chris Dobey. He had that 11 darter followed by a 12 darter that took him from 7-5 to 9-5, and even when Rob Cross came back, won the next two legs, he fluffed his lines. He had 6 darts at 100 and didn't get one dart double, and Chris Dobey was able to get over the line, and he showed his bottle at the end there as well, because he had 41 left and the dart going for the single 9 was underneath the treble. It was in that small margin of the single 9, so there were some nervy moments there in that final leg, and to get it done, he held it together well, and every credit to him. And you mentioned there about the Premier League as well. You could probably say he's the Premier League killer, because the players that he's knocked out at the weekend, 4 out of the 5 were looking to get into that Premier League. You had Joe Cullen, you had Luke Humphries, Dirk van Dijvenbode, Rob Cross himself saying that he wasn't interested, he wasn't in the Premier League, still beat him in the final, and that's made a difference to the selectors, the PDC putting Chris Dobey in. So it's a big weekend in the career of Chris Dobey, and it could just be the start of bigger and better things for him.